Christian Runcorn died inside a bakery oven at the store on Mumford Road.
The other day, this one lady that works at my office got her leg trapped in an elevator. Don't worry, she's fine, but it really made me think about how badly this could have ended. And so, like any reasonably normal human being, I looked up and started reading about some of the most disturbing deaths that have happened in workplaces, and some of the cases I've found genuinely make me think that being at work is a workplace hazard in itself. So, viewer discretion is definitely advised, and I hope you don't work in any of the industries these 14 unfortunate people worked in. It's February 24th, 2010, at the animal theme park called SeaWorld outside Orlando, Florida. And there's this so-called premium SeaWorld dining experience thing going on, which has an all-you-can-eat buffet at a bunch of reserved poolside tables near the killer whale tanks called Dine with Shamu, and the orca show is wrapping up for the afternoon. Shamu was actually the name of the first killer whale SeaWorld bought in December 1965, and after the original Shamu died in 1971, SeaWorld quite literally trademarked the name and began using it as a sort of a universal stage name for all their performing killer whales. But little did they know that one day this name is going to be associated with some of the most horrifying and tragic incidents to have ever happened at a workplace. Now, the small crowd of guests at the open-air restaurant is finishing up their lunch while watching one of the park's senior trainers do what she's done, like quite literally 1,000 times before, interact with a 5-ton orca, feeding it and hugging it like it's the most natural thing in the world. The senior trainer's name is Dawn Branchot, and she was, by pretty much every conceivable measure, exactly the trainer SeaWorld would put on its billboards. And, as it happens, they literally did. Her face was plastered across Orlando, smiling next to whales the size of school buses. She was 40 years old, had been with SeaWorld for 15 years, and was the senior trainer they trusted to revamp the entire Shamu show. Outside of work, she ran marathons, lifted weights, volunteered at animal shelters, because she really loved animals, and she kept what can only be described as a small backyard zoo because she had 2 chocolate Labradors, plus various stray ducks, chickens, rabbits, and birds she'd rescued over the years. She was, in every sense, the SeaWorld dream employee, which only made what happened next all the more inconvenient for the company that had spent years using her face to sell tickets. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the end-of-show routine that afternoon was nothing Dawn hadn't done countless times before. She lay down on a slide-out, which is basically a shallow platform covered by less than a foot of water, rubbed the orca's head, and prepared to wrap up the performance. The orca she was working with was named Tilikum, and he was the largest in SeaWorld's collection, a 12,000-pound bull who had been performing for the park for nearly 2 decades. Remember that name, by the way. What happened next took roughly the time it takes to register that something's wrong. Witnesses heard Dawn yelp, "Ouch," and then watched as Tilikum pulled her into the pool. Some accounts say he grabbed her by her ponytail, others say it was actually her arm, but either way she was in the water, and Tilikum was not letting her go. The staff scrambled, throwing food and dropping nets into the water, trying everything they could think of to distract a 12,000-pound animal that very clearly did not want to be distracted. They eventually managed to herd him into a smaller medical pool, where, after about 45 minutes, he finally released her. By that point, of course, it was far too late. Dawn had died from a combination of drowning and severe physical trauma, with injuries extensive enough that I'll spare you the full autopsy report because I do not want to get demonetized. Now, I know this is very tragic, but I'm actually genuinely infuriated because Tilikum had actually killed before, not even once, but twice, and SeaWorld knew about this. In 1991, at a different park called Sealand of the Pacific in Canada, he and 2 other orcas had drowned a trainer named Kelty Byrne, who was actually the first human ever recorded to be killed by an orca in captivity. Kelty was just 20 years old, and was one of Canada's best swimmers at the time, who loved marine life so much that she was studying marine biology in college, and she had taken the job at Sealand, mostly to gain hands-on real-life experience and fund her education. But none of that mattered when she slipped and fell into the pool, where Tilikum grabbed her and dragged her underwater and kept her there for 15 minutes. Even though Kelty's death was ruled an accidental drowning, Sealand of the Pacific never recovered from the tragedy and closed a year later in 1992, and after the closure, Tilikum was sold to SeaWorld Orlando. Then, on the 5th of July in 1999, almost 8 years after Tilikum killed Kelty, this 27-year-old guy named Daniel Dukes visited SeaWorld Orlando, and for some reason he was really mesmerized by seeing Tilikum perform. So much so, in fact, that when the park had to close for the night, he hid himself, and once all the staff had left a couple hours later, he stripped naked and went into Tilikum's pool, where Tilikum did to him what Tilikum is known to do to humans. he tore him apart. So much so, in fact, that when Daniel's body was found the next day on July 6, 1999, the medical staff couldn't even tell if the body was once a man or a woman. Daniel's parents later sued SeaWorld because they believed that the reason their son did this to begin with was because of how SeaWorld depicted orcas to be super friendly in their advertisements, but they later withdrew the case. 3 deaths now linked to a single whale, and SeaWorld's response had essentially been to keep him performing, keep collecting paychecks, and keep putting trainers in the water with him. And then the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA for short, got involved. In case you don't know what that is, it's basically the US federal agency under the Department of Labor, which was created in 1971 to ensure safe working conditions. And by the way, they come up in like most of the later cases as well, so buckle up. Anyway, when the OSHA investigated the cases, they fined SeaWorld a grand total of $75,000 for what they classified as willful safety violations, which is the legal equivalent of saying you knew and you did nothing. For a multi-billion-dollar corporation, this fine was basically like a parking ticket. But naturally, SeaWorld challenged the fines anyway, denied the findings, and framed the OSHA as ignorant of what marine mammal care actually involved. SeaWorld's public-facing theory for what had happened that day, by the way, was that Tilikum had been distracted by Dawn's ponytail. Yeah, as if a 12,000-pound predator with a documented history of fatally injuring people had simply been overstimulated by hair. The ponytail hypothesis, as it became known, conveniently placed the blame on Dawn herself, a woman who could no longer defend the choice of how she'd worn her hair to work that day. The fallout did eventually reshape the entire industry, though. A documentary called Blackfish came out 3 years later and exposed basically everything, and public opinion turned hard against SeaWorld, and the company eventually announced it would stop breeding orcas in captivity. Tilikum himself spent the rest of his life in increasing isolation in a back pool and died on the 6th of January 2017 at the age of 36. But while Dawn's death at least sparked a national reckoning about worker safety and animal captivity, the next workplace death on this list got no such reckoning. In fact, the company at the center of it spent years making sure nobody talked about it at all. It's July 8th, 2009, at a chocolate processing plant in Camden, New Jersey. And when the story of what's about to happen here breaks later that afternoon, a few of the local Philadelphia area newscasters will reportedly fail to quite suppress their giggles while reading the headline on air, because on its face, "Man falls into vat of chocolate" sounds like the opening of a bad sitcom episode, rather than a fatal industrial accident. What actually happened that morning, though, was about as far from sitcom material as it gets. The man in question was 29-year-old Vincent Smith II. He had moved to Camden only about a month earlier, coming down from rural Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, where he hadn't been able to find steady work, and he was now living with his Aunt Teresa Smith, who herself had only landed her own current factory job through a temp agency, because in this part of Camden, that was essentially the only way to get hired anywhere, really. So Vincent signed up with one of the local agencies called Heads Up Staffing, and his very first assignment was at a warehouse on the eastern edge of the city that, somewhat enchantingly, smelled of imported cocoa beans. He'd been on the job for exactly 2 weeks. Now, the warehouse itself was technically owned by a company called Lyons & Sons, but the chocolate melting operation running inside it was owned by a separate company called Cocoa Services, which itself was contracted to do work for the Hershey Company. Yeah, the same Hershey company that has that famous chocolate and whatnot. Anyway, so if you're keeping score at home, Vincent worked for the staffing agency, who sent him to the warehouse owner, who managed the floor for the contractor, who was making product for Hershey. That's 4 corporate layers between Vincent and the brand, whose chocolate he was about to die producing, which, as it would later turn out, was very much the entire point of having 4 layers in the first place, but more on that in a bit. Around 10:30 that morning, Vincent and his co-workers came back from their morning break and climbed up onto a 9-foot-high platform that ran above an 8-foot-deep, 14-foot-long, 6-foot-wide vat of melted chocolate, heated to a steady 120 degrees Fahrenheit, with a large mechanical paddle called an agitator turning constantly inside it. Their job was to drop blocks of solid, unsweetened chocolate down through an opening in the platform floor, where the blocks would gradually melt into the liquid below, and eventually be loaded onto tankers headed for Hershey factories. That particular morning's batch was actually a special order, and the blocks were unusually small, which meant they couldn't be fed through the normal automated grinder, and had to instead be hand-tossed straight down into the hole. The platform itself, meanwhile, was covered with sheets of cardboard that had become slippery from chocolate residue, and the emergency shutoff for the agitator wasn't even on the platform at all, but rather down a flight of stairs and several feet away, which is the kind of design choice that genuinely makes you wonder if anyone involved in building this thing had ever in their entire lives actually met a human being. Now, Vincent was the first one up onto the platform that morning, chatting with the co-workers still on the floor below as he got ready to start his shift. According to the others, he took what looked like a casual step forward, and then he dropped straight through the opening in the floor. And the opening was so small, in fact, that the company's own spokesperson would later admit he was surprised a grown man could even fit through it, which is the kind of statement that sounds vaguely defensive until you realize he was essentially confirming on the record that the gap was just barely wide enough to swallow a person whole. Vincent landed in the chocolate, and almost immediately afterwards, the agitator paddle struck him in the head and killed him. His co-workers grabbed at his arm, his clothes, and his belt, and tried for several minutes to haul him out. But Vincent was a large man, and they just couldn't get the leverage. One of them was reportedly still holding onto his belt when firefighters finally arrived about 10 minutes later. And this is where the corporate accountability dodge really gets going, because when investigators showed up afterwards, they discovered that Lyons and Sons had been operating this entire chocolate processing facility without a business license for somewhere around 6 or 7 years, and the City of Camden's licensing bureau had simply had no idea the plant even existed, which conveniently explained why no city inspector had ever set foot inside it. Yeah, OSHA's eventual investigation then found 12 serious safety violations across the two companies, including no railing around the platform openings, no warning signs on any of the melting tanks, no fire extinguisher training for any of the employees, no first aid program at all, and the various other glaring absences you would absolutely expect at an operation that had been running off the books for the better part of a decade. The total fine across both companies came out to $39,200, which, for some context, was roughly 0.0007% of Hershey's annual revenue that year. As for Hershey itself, the company whose chocolate Vincent had actually been melting when he died, they offered the standard "our thoughts are with the family" statement, and then just over 2 weeks later, on July 23rd, the CEO held the company's quarterly earnings call to celebrate better-than-expected profits driven by, you guessed it, the very outsourcing program that had put Vincent on that platform in the first place. Vincent's death was not mentioned even once during that call, because as far as Hershey was legally concerned, he had simply never worked for them. Vincent's family did eventually file a personal injury lawsuit, naming 32 separate safety failures at the plant, and his Aunt Teresa told reporters at the gates of the warehouse that day that all it would have taken to save her nephew's life was a basic safety harness, which, given everything that came out about the place in the months afterwards, was almost certainly the truest thing anyone said about the case for weeks. But while Vincent's death at least made it into the local news, even if it was treated as a punchline, this next workplace tragedy unfolded somewhere far more remote and far more isolated, and the victim didn't even have as much as their name reported on the news. Okay, so this next one takes us all the way back to June 29th, 2015, at a factory of the German automobile manufacturer called Volkswagen, or VW for short, which is in this town called Baunatal, in central Germany about an hour or so south of Hanover, which is, by the way, Volkswagen's single largest components plant in the entire world, with somewhere around 16,000 employees on the payroll, and which has been pumping out engines, gearboxes, and electric motors for VW since basically the late 1950s. And specifically inside this gigantic facility, there's a section called Hall 6, which is where they assemble the electric motor parts, and Hall 6 is one of those modern, semi-automated production environments where roughly 800 industrial robots work alongside human technicians to put everything together. And on this particular Monday morning, one of those robots was about to make international headlines and kick off one of the more philosophically uncomfortable news cycles of the entire decade. The guy at the center of this story was 21 years old, and his name was actually never publicly released, partly because Germany's privacy laws around workplace accidents are basically the strictest in Europe, but also because, as we're about to see, his death turned out to be deeply inconvenient for every single party involved in employing him. So just for the sake of having something to call him, we'll call him Lucas from now on. What we do know about Lucas is that he was not actually a Volkswagen employee at all. He was actually a contractor working for a smaller external installation company based in Saxony, which is the eastern part of Germany about 3 hours away from Baunatal. And he and a few of his colleagues had been brought in specifically to install and configure a brand new industrial robot on the Hall 6 production line. The robot itself, by the way, had not yet been fully set up that morning, which is going to become extremely relevant in about 30 seconds. Now, in case you have not spent a lot of time thinking about manufacturing automation lately, here is how industrial robots like the one Lucas was working with actually work. They are these gigantic multi-axis arms, basically, capable of grabbing, lifting, welding, and flinging things around with enough raw force to crush a human body without so much as slowing down, which is exactly why, under normal operating conditions, they live inside these enclosed steel safety cages with sensors on the doors that automatically cut all power to the robot the moment a human steps inside. The cage is kind of the entire point, Q's. It is the only thing standing between the robot and a fatality. Without the cage, this is just a giant metal arm flailing around with the strength of about 10 weightlifters and exactly zero awareness of what a human being even is. But here's the thing. When a robot is being set up for the first time, like the one Lucas was installing, those safety systems are not actually fully functional yet, because, well, the safety systems are part of what's being set up. So during installation, technicians physically have to enter the cage to position the robot by hand, calibrate its movements, and program its motion paths, all while the robot is sitting there in this kind of half-active state. It is, even at the best of times, basically the single most dangerous moment in a robot's entire operational life cycle, which is why it usually requires extremely careful coordination between literally everyone involved. That coordination, very obviously, did not happen. According to the version of events that VW would eventually release, Lucas was inside the cage with the robot, and a second worker from the same external company was standing outside the cage, presumably operating some kind of control panel. And at some point during the setup process, that second worker either signaled the robot to move, or the robot just moved on its own as part of its pre-programmed motion path. Either way, the arm swung, grabbed Lucas, and pinned him against a metal plate inside the cage with enough force to completely crush his chest. The other workers in the area heard the impact and rushed in. Emergency services arrived as fast as they could. Resuscitation was attempted both at the scene and in the ambulance, and Lucas was rushed to Castle Hospital, where doctors kept working on him in the emergency room until he was eventually pronounced dead from his injuries. He had turned 21 only a few months earlier. And here is where the corporate response gets, in my opinion, genuinely fascinating to sit and watch unfold. Because within roughly 24 hours of Lucas's death, VW spokesman Heiko Hilwig was already publicly telling reporters that, and I quote, "Initial conclusions indicate that human error was to blame rather than a problem with the robot," which is a really interesting sentence to publicly say while a man's body is still essentially warm at the morgue and the official investigation has not even properly started. It is also a sentence that does a very specific kind of legal work, because if you read it carefully, you will notice that it does not actually specify which human was at fault. It just kind of vaguely gestures at the room and lets everyone draw their own conclusions about which entry-level Saxon contractor probably messed up. And there was also this other very convenient detail that VW kept emphasizing in its own statements, which is that the robot did not technically belong to Volkswagen yet. See, because the installation was not complete, the machine was, on paper, still the legal property and responsibility of the external contractor company that had sent Lucas in, meaning that Volkswagen, the multi-billion euro corporation whose plant this was happening inside, whose production line the robot was being installed on, and whose product the robot was about to start manufacturing for, was somehow technically not the employer of the dead guy and not the owner of the robot that killed him. They were just the very large, very profitable building inside, which all of this happened to occur. Sound familiar? The Castle Public Prosecutor's Office did formally open an investigation into possible negligence charges, but to this day, there has been no public follow-up on whether anyone was ever actually charged with anything. Meanwhile, the international press cycle pivoted almost immediately into a kind of high-minded ethics debate, with various AI and robotics professors lining up to explain to the world that, technically, robots cannot really be blamed for things they do because they have no real intentions or emotions or purposes, which is true. But it also very conveniently took a huge amount of pressure off the actual companies who do have intentions and purposes, namely the ones who were responsible for making sure this never happened in the first place. And while everyone was busy debating whether a robot can be a murderer, the deeper question of who was supposed to be supervising the kid in the cage just kind of quietly evaporated. But Lucas is far from the only person who has suffered this fate. Okay. So almost exactly 8 years and 4 months after Lucas got crushed to death by a robot in a German factory, the world's industrial automation industry had clearly learned absolutely nothing, because on the evening of November 7th, 2023, in a small county called Goseong in the southern part of South Korea, a man in his 40s was about to die in basically the exact same way, for basically the exact same reason. The location was the Donggoseong Export Agricultural Complex, which is a vegetable packaging facility that primarily handles bell peppers being shipped out to other countries across Asia, and which, like most of rural South Korea's agricultural sector, has been steadily replacing its aging human workforce with automation for the better part of the last decade. According to the International Federation of Robotics, South Korea actually has the highest density of industrial robots in the entire world, with about 1,000 robots per 10,000 employees, which is more than triple what China has, and the agricultural communities in particular have really leaned into this hard, because basically nobody under the age of 50 wants to work the packing lines anymore. The guy at the center of this case was, once again, an external contractor whose name was never publicly released. So for the sake of having something to call him, we'll just call him Min Soo from now on. Min Soo was in his early 40s, and he worked for the company that had actually built and installed the 2 pick-and-place robots that the pepper plant was using on its production line. And on this particular Tuesday evening, he had been sent over to the facility to run some final sensor checks on one of those robots, because the official test run had originally been scheduled for the previous day, November 6th, but had been pushed back by 2 whole days due to issues with, of all things, the robot's sensors. Yes, the sensors. The same sensors that were about to mistake him for a vegetable. So in case you have not been closely keeping up with developments in bell pepper logistics, here is how a pick-and-place robot works. It is basically a giant robotic arm with a claw on the end, and the claw is programmed to identify boxes coming down a conveyor belt, grab them, and stack them up onto pallets. And the way it identifies those boxes is through, you guessed it, sensors. So when Min Soo walked up to the machine late that night carrying a cardboard box in his hands, just so he could test how the machine would respond to it, the robot did exactly what it had been built to do. It saw an object that looked roughly box-shaped, swung its arm around, grabbed him, and slammed him face-first down into the conveyor belt, with enough force to crush his chest and skull simultaneously. He was rushed to the hospital, but, you can really only do so much for a person whose chest and head have just been compressed by an industrial claw, and Min Soo was pronounced dead from his injuries shortly afterwards. And here is the part that I personally find genuinely uncomfortable, because in the days after Min Soo's death, once the international press started running headlines about how a South Korean robot had confused a human being for a box of peppers, the local Goseong police actually came out and pushed back hard on that characterization, with one of the investigators explicitly telling reporters that, and I quote, "It's clearly not a case where a robot confused a human with a box. This wasn't a very sophisticated machine." Which is technically a defense of the robot's programming, I guess, but it is also, simultaneously, just the most damning thing you could possibly say about the situation, because what he was actually saying was that the robot wasn't even smart enough to make the mistake of confusing Min Soo for a box. It just grabbed whatever happened to wander into its operational range, which, if anything, somehow makes the entire thing worse. The plant owners did go on to issue the usual corporate statement, calling for a precise and safe system to be developed going forward, which, in corporate speak, basically translates to, "We have noticed one of our employees is dead and we will now think about it for like a week." This next one takes us to Sunday, July 13th, 2025, in a little industrial city called Vernon, California, which is about 4 miles south of downtown Los Angeles, and which is, weirdly enough, one of the smallest incorporated cities in the entire United States, with a permanent population of fewer than 300 actual residents, but somewhere around 50,000 daily workers, because the entire place is essentially just one giant zoned-off industrial corridor full of meatpacking plants, frozen food facilities, and warehouses. And on this particular Sunday evening at around 9:30 p.m., at one of those facilities, a frozen burrito plant called Tina's Burritos, to be exact, a 19-year-old kid was about to die in one of the most genuinely horrible ways I have ever had to cover on this channel. The kid's name was Brian Neftali Otoniel Kanu George, and he was originally from Santa Lucia, Utatlan, a small town of about 22,000 people in the Sololar department of Guatemala, where the local economy basically runs on agriculture, traditional artisan crafts, and the money sent home by relatives working abroad in places exactly like Vernon, and Brian was one of those relatives. He had migrated to the United States looking for work, eventually landed at the Tina's Burritos plant, and, like a lot of migrant workers in the American food processing industry, he was almost certainly earning close to minimum wage, with very little in the way of formal protections, real safety training, or legal recourse if something happened to go wrong. And he was again just 19 years old. That Sunday night, Brian had been assigned to clean one of the factory's industrial meat grinders, which, in case you have never actually seen one of these things up close, is basically a giant steel container with a powered auger at the bottom that grinds and processes raw meat into the filling that eventually ends up inside the burritos. To clean one of these properly, you actually have to physically get inside the container, which is fine and totally safe, as long as one extremely important rule is followed, which is that the machine has to be completely shut off, locked and tagged out, so that it cannot under any circumstances spontaneously turn back on while there is a literal human being inside of it. The procedure is called lockout tagout, or LOTO for short, and it is, like, the single most basic safety protocol in all of industrial food processing. And this LOTO procedure was either not followed that night, or it failed catastrophically, because while Brian was inside the machine cleaning it, the grinder somehow activated before his co-workers heard him screaming. They ran over and tried to stop the mechanism, but they were not able to, not soon enough anyway. By the time emergency responders showed up at the plant, Brian had already turned into ground meat. Now, Tina's Burritos, in the corporate statement they put out 2 days later, described the incident as their employee getting stuck in an empty kettle that he was cleaning, which is a really interesting choice of words because technically a meat grinder is a kind of kettle, I guess. But calling it that in your official press release is basically the public relations equivalent of describing a wood chipper as a leaf management device. The statement went on to say that their hearts were with his family, that this was a devastating loss for everyone at Tina's, and that they were cooperating fully with the authorities. It did not say anything about LOTO procedures, training protocols, or who exactly had been responsible for making sure the machine was off when Brian got inside of it. OSHA, of course, opened an investigation. And here is where the numbers get genuinely insulting, because under current US federal law, the maximum fine OSHA is even allowed to impose for what it classifies as a serious safety violation is $16,550. For willful or repeated violations, that maximum jumps to about $165,500 per violation. So even if Tina's Burritos ends up getting hit with the most severe possible classification on multiple counts, the total fine is going to be a tiny fraction of what one decent week of frozen burrito sales pulls in for them. A 19-year-old kid is dead, and the absolute upper limit of what the United States government can actually do about it on the safety side is, charitably, the cost of a used Toyota. And again, Brian is far from the only person who ended up becoming ground meat at their workplace. Okay, so this next case actually happened way before Brian's, all the way back to the late hours of April 26, 2013, and this time the location is a meat processing plant called Interstate Meat Distributors, which is based out of Clackamas, Oregon, just a short drive south of Portland. Interstate Meat is one of those mid-size regional meat companies that grinds raw beef into hamburger and then packages it for distribution to commercial customers all across Oregon and southwestern Washington. It also, as we are about to see, had a really uniquely terrible safety record, even for the meat industry, which is genuinely saying something. The guy at the center of this case was 41-year-old Hugo Avalos Shannon, who lived in southeast Portland with his wife and 3 kids. Hugo was, like Brian, a contractor, but in his case, he was not even technically employed by the meat plant itself. He worked for a separate cleaning company called DCS Sanitation Management, which had been hired by Interstate Meat to handle the overnight sanitation shifts at the Clackamas facility. So once again, just like in the Vincent Smith case from way earlier, you had a worker stuck right at the very bottom of a multi-layered corporate structure, doing the actual physical labor that someone with a much fancier job title several rungs up the ladder did not want to be legally responsible for. Now here's the part of this story that I find genuinely infuriating, and we have not even gotten to the death yet. Because in October of 2012, which is just 6 months before Hugo's accident, Oregon's state-level OSHA had actually inspected this exact same interstate meat plant and formally cited them for failing to properly lock out their machines during cleaning operations. The inspectors had specifically warned Interstate Meat that workers were being exposed to the risk of, and I quote, unexpected startup of the machinery with the very real potential for serious injuries. Another worker at that same plant had also already lost an entire finger to one of the machines at some earlier point, so Interstate Meat had, on paper, been put on notice. That brings us to the night of April 26, 2013. Around 11:45 p.m., Hugo was working his usual sanitation shift, using a garden hose to spray hot water on a large industrial meat blender, which was the machine Interstate Meat used to regulate the fat content in their ground beef. And the machine was, of course, still completely powered on the entire time he was cleaning it, because the lockout-tagout procedures that OSHA had warned the plant about, like 6 full months earlier, had quite clearly never actually been put into practice. What investigators eventually pieced together was that a coupling on the garden hose probably came loose. The loose end of the hose then fell into the open mixing tank, and the hose immediately wrapped itself around the spinning mixing bar inside the tank, which was rotating at full speed. The hose, of course, was also still attached to Hugo. He was pulled into the machine legs first when his co-workers heard him screaming, and one of them managed to hit the emergency stop button. But by that point, the rotating blades had already done what rotating blades inside a blender are designed to do. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as blunt force injuries and chopping wounds. Hugo's body was not even actually removed from the machine until the following morning, and the plant, by the way, continued normal operations for the rest of that day, while Hugo's remains were still stuck to one of their machines. When OSHA finally finished their investigation, they fined DCS Sanitation $6,300 for the violations that led to Hugo's death. They then fined Interstate Meat itself $450. Yeah, you heard the correct $450 total for the death of a 41-year-old father of 3 on their property, on their machine, after they had already been formally warned about this exact same safety failure 6 months earlier. The fine for parking illegally in front of a fire hydrant in some American cities is genuinely higher than that. And the most darkly absurd footnote to this entire case is that just a few days after Hugo died, when state investigators came back to do a follow-up inspection of the plant, they observed DCS Sanitation employees still cleaning the machines with hoses wrapped around their bodies while the machines were actively running. So nothing even changed. They had watched a man die in exactly this way, and then they had just gone ahead and kept doing it. Hugo's family eventually filed a $5 million civil lawsuit against Interstate Meat, but interestingly, they chose not to include DCS Sanitation as a defendant in the case, and their attorney refused to publicly explain why. Make of that what you will. And no, I'm not done with all of my meat grinder cases just yet. Before I get into this next one, I do want to take a quick second to acknowledge that yes, this is now the 3rd meat grinder death in this video in a row, and no, I am not doing this on purpose. The American meat processing industry just genuinely has a body count problem that is wildly out of proportion with basically every other manufacturing sector in the country, and the more you actually start looking into it, the worse it somehow gets. This particular case happened on Monday, April 22nd, 2019, at a wholesale meat processing facility called the Economy Locker Storage Company, located in the small town of Pennsdale, Pennsylvania, which is way out in rural Lycoming County. The victim's name was Jill Greninger, and she was 35 years old, originally from nearby Williamsport, with 3 kids, a partner of 11 years named Jack, and her first grandchild was due literally just 6 months later, in that coming October. She was, by every account from her family and friends, the kind of person who could pretty much light up an entire room just by walking into it. That Monday afternoon, Jill was working alone in a section of the facility that housed one of the company's commercial meat grinders, which, somewhat insanely, was mounted about 6 feet off the ground, meaning workers had to physically climb up onto a set of wheeled rolling stairs in order to even access it. According to the Lycoming County coroner, Jill was standing at the top of those stairs and likely reaching into the grinder for something when she either lost her balance and fell in, or was pulled in by the rotating mechanism. Nobody actually saw the accident happen. What did happen, though, was that a co-worker walking through that part of the facility a short while later heard, as he later put it, an odd sound coming from the grinder. He went over to investigate, and when he realized what was actually going on, he immediately turned the machine off. But by then, Jill had already been, well, you know. It then took fire and emergency personnel over 2 hours of physically disassembling the grinder piece by piece to recover her body, whatever pieces of it were left. OSHA's eventual investigation turned up 11 separate serious safety violations at the facility, and Economy Locker Storage was fined a total of $49,062, which is technically a more meaningful number than what Hugo's plant got hit with, but still amounts to roughly the cost of a single mid-range pickup truck for a death that left behind 3 kids and a partner who would now never get to meet their first grandchild together. At this point, I think we just need to admit that something is genuinely, deeply structurally wrong with the American meat processing industry, because here we are again, on a different date, in a different state, at a completely different plant, with yet another worker who got pulled into yet another machine. And specifically, this one takes us to the early evening of Saturday, December 16th, 2017, at a meat packing facility called Fresh Mark, which is located in Canton, Ohio, about an hour's drive south of Cleveland. Freshmark, by the way, produces bacon, hot dogs, dry sausage, ham, and deli meats under 3 different brand names, which are Sugardale Foods, Sugardale Food Service, and Superior's brand meats. So if you have ever bought a Sugardale ham, this is the plant it came from. And now let me tell you about the working conditions of this plant. The guy at the center of this case was 62 years old, and his name was Samuel Martinez, and he was originally from Guatemala, just like Brian from the Tina's Burritos case. By 2017, Samuel had been working at the Freshmark plant in Canton, putting in long hours on a production line that, according to basically every single employee review you can find online about this place, regularly ran workers 10+ hours a day, 7 days a week, for months at a time, with a starting wage of $9 an hour. Now, before we actually get into what happened to Samuel that Saturday, I really do need to take a second to talk about a completely different death that had already happened at this exact same plant 6 years earlier, because the pattern here is honestly extremely important. In 2011, a 20-year-old worker named Marcos Perez Velasquez, who was also originally from Guatemala, was electrocuted and killed at this same Canton plant while attempting to plug a 220-volt fan into a 480-volt outlet while standing in a pool of water. Yes, you heard all of that correctly. A 20-year-old kid was sent to plug in fundamentally mismatched electrical equipment while literally standing in water, and the result was, predictably, exactly the result you would expect. So Samuel was not Freshmark's first Guatemalan worker to die on the job, he was their second. That brings us to roughly 4:50 p.m. on December 16th, 2017, when Samuel was working near a piece of equipment called a waste grinder, which is exactly what it sounds like. Basically an industrial machine with a powerful internal auger that processes the slurry of meat scraps, fat, bone fragments, and other byproducts that come off the production line throughout the day. According to the Stark County coroner's investigator, Samuel either deliberately stepped into, or somehow lost his footing near the chute that fed material down into the auger, and his leg got caught, and the auger then very quickly pulled the rest of him straight in. I mean, I don't really understand why the coroner would even think Samuel would step in on purpose, but either way, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Freshmark's response was, you guessed it, the standard corporate statement template. Their director of marketing, of all people, was the one who issued the press release, and it expressed that their primary concern rested with the well-being of the employee's family, and that they were cooperating fully with the authorities. There was no mention at all of the fact that this was now their second fatality in 6 years, and no mention of the 2009 incident at this same facility, in which a different worker had lost 2 whole fingers trying to clear a jam in a pepperoni machine, an incident for which OSHA had fined the company a grand total of $2,125 for 2 fingers. Wow. And here is the broader context that I think really matters most, because between 2004 and 2013, according to a Government Accountability Office report, 151 meat and poultry workers died in work-related incidents across the United States, which works out to, on average, more than 1 worker death every single month for a decade straight in this one single industry. And the overall trend has not really slowed down since. Okay, enough of meat grinder incidents. Let's move on to something different now. This next case is going to break the meat grinder streak, but only technically, because while the specific machine involved here is different, basically every other element of this story is going to feel completely depressingly familiar. Specifically, this one takes us to Thursday, June 26, 2025, in a small town called Perryville in southeastern Missouri, about 80 miles south of St. Louis, at a cereal manufacturing facility called the Gilster Mary Lee Cereal Plant. Gilster Mary Lee, by the way, is one of the largest contract manufacturers of breakfast cereal in the entire United States, and they specifically produce the store brand cereals that you have probably eaten without ever even realizing it, supplying products to giant retailers like Walmart, Sam's Club, and Albertsons. The guy at the center of this story was 38 years old, a Guatemalan national just like Brian and Samuel from earlier, and his real name was Nicolas Lopez Gomez. But here is the part of his story that I find genuinely bleak, because for nearly the entire time Nicholas worked at the Gilster Mary Lee plant, which was actually 9 straight years, he was not employed there under his own real name at all. He was working under the alias Edward Avila. This is a really common reality for undocumented workers across the American food production industry, and the layers of corporate non-responsibility that this kind of setup enables are honestly pretty staggering, because if Nicholas had ever been seriously injured at any point during those 9 years, the paper trail would have shown a man named Edward Avila being injured, not Nicolas Lopez Gomez. He worked there for almost a full decade, and the people signing his paychecks did not actually have to know who he was. That brings us to around 3 p.m. on the afternoon of June 26th. Nicholas had been assigned to power wash the outside of one of the plant's massive industrial cereal drying ovens, which, when you imagine an industrial oven, you should really be picturing something genuinely massive, like the size of a small house, with a hollow interior that workers have to sometimes physically climb inside in order to clean or maintain. The oven that afternoon, very importantly, was completely shut off and not running. And yet somehow, at some point during that power washing job, Nicholas ended up trapped inside of it. And here is where the entire case gets genuinely strange, because nobody actually witnessed how he got inside, and to this day, there is still no real public explanation of how he got in there, or what specifically ended up killing him. His co-workers eventually realized he was missing, called 911, and emergency responders showed up within minutes. Less than 20 minutes after that, the Perry County coroner pronounced Nicholas dead at the scene. The oven, again, had not been on, which means he did not die from heat. So the actual cause of death has, ever since, just kind of been unclear from the public record. When OSHA finally finished its investigation, they cited Gilster Mary Lee for 10 separate serious safety violations, including failure to follow confined space entry procedures, no permits, no attendance, no rescue planning, unsafe ladder usage, and failure to ensure that equipment was fully de-energized before maintenance. The initial proposed penalty was $207,112, which is actually one of the more substantial OSHA fines we've seen anywhere in this video. But in classic OSHA fashion, that figure was then very quietly reduced down to $91,000 through what the agency officially calls its standard penalty adjustment process, which is just bureaucratic language for, we asked the company to please give us a discount on the fine, and they very kindly obliged us. And meanwhile, the case is somehow still officially open as of right now, with an abatement deadline of May 15th, 2026, which is to say, even though this happened almost a full year ago, and OSHA documented basically every safety failure imaginable, the actual fix at the plant is still technically a work in progress. Okay, so this next case actually takes us out of the United States entirely, and up into Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, on the night of Saturday, October 19th, 2024, at a perfectly ordinary suburban Walmart on a street called Mumford Road in the western part of the city. And while everything about this case is going to look like a pretty normal and rather mundane retail setting, it also happens to be, in my opinion, the most genuinely awful death on this entire list, and one of the most haunting workplace tragedies to take place anywhere in the world in recent memory. The 19-year-old at the center of this case was named Gursimran Kaur, and she had moved to Canada from India with her mother, Mandip Kaur, about 3 years earlier. Both Gursimran and Mandip actually worked at the same Mumford Road Walmart, and they had been working there together for the last 2 years, and Gursimran was, by every single account from her family, her friends, and her former teachers, a genuinely exceptional young woman. She had been valedictorian of her graduating class, and had her sights firmly set on one day becoming a doctor. And on the night before this Saturday shift, she had been at a family celebration, laughing and having fun, and absolutely not, in any way that anyone close to her could detect, exhibiting any signs at all of being unhappy with her life. That Saturday evening, Gursimran was working her shift in the bakery section of the store. Now, walk-in commercial ovens, just so we are all clear about what we are picturing here, are basically these big metal rooms with racks inside of them, used by retail bakeries to bake very large volumes of bread, croissants, donuts, or whatever the store happens to be selling that day. They are big enough that a human being can physically walk inside, and they always, by safety regulation, have a working internal release mechanism on the door, specifically so that anyone who happens to find themselves inside, one can let themselves out again. Because, you know, the alternative is the sort of thing that ends up on a YouTube video exactly like this one. At some point during her shift that evening, Gursimran went into the oven and did not come back out of it. Mandip, working her own shift on the floor of the same store, started getting concerned when she had not seen her daughter in over an hour, which was deeply unusual for them. She tried calling Gursimran's phone and got no answer at all. She then started texting her, but again with no answer. Then she asked some of the other employees on the floor if they had seen her daughter recently, but everyone she asked just kind of brushed her concern off and assumed Gursimran was probably off helping a customer somewhere in the genuinely gigantic store. Mandip began to panic, because Gursimran was the kind of kid who would, basically, never just switch her phone off in the middle of a workday for no reason, and she ended up tracking down 2 of the managers on duty, both of whom admitted that they had also not seen her in a while either. The group of them then began searching the store together. When they eventually arrived at the bakery section, one of the managers noticed something deeply unsettling. There was a thick, dark, black-brown liquid resembling tar, as Mandip would later describe it to the Daily Mail, slowly leaking out from the back of one of the bakery's walk-in ovens. The oven, by the way, was still on, and that liquid was Gursimran. Yeah. Mandip opened the oven door. Her daughter's body was inside, charred, lying next to the baking racks, and, in Mandip's own words, no longer recognizable as the child she had raised. Mandip immediately collapsed onto the floor and hyperventilated, lying there next to her daughter's body for somewhere around 5 to 10 minutes before anyone could even move her. She would later tell reporters, "Within seconds, my life has changed forever." Police were called to the store at around 9:30 p.m. after the dispatcher received a report about a female locked inside an oven in the bakery. When the dispatcher initially relayed the call out to the responding officers, the staff at the store apparently were not even sure if they were going to be able to turn the oven off. The officers eventually arrived. Gursimran's body was by then out of the oven, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. A month later, in November 2024, the Halifax Regional Police announced that they had ruled out foul play and concluded that the death was, and I quote, "not suspicious." This is the part that I think really should ideally generate an enormous number of follow-up questions. Like, for example, how did a 19-year-old end up locked inside an oven that was hot enough to incinerate her body? Why didn't she use the internal release mechanism that the door is required to have? Was she conscious? Did she scream for help? How long was she in there? The local police did not have any answers to any of those questions, and they essentially admitted on the record that they were never going to. One police spokesperson, in their public statement on the case, even quietly noted that, and again, I quote, "there are questions that might never have answers." The Nova Scotia Department of Labour then ran their own separate, completely independent investigation, which lasted, in total, roughly 18 months. And in February of this year, 2026, they finally announced their findings, which were, and I am genuinely not making this up, that the oven was in proper working order at the time of the incident, and that there had been zero safety violations whatsoever that could possibly have contributed to a 19-year-old girl being baked alive inside it. They also added, just as a kind of cherry on top, that there were no broader safety concerns associated with the type of oven, in general, which is a sentence I really want you to sit with for a second, because what they are essentially saying is that the design of the machine that killed Gursimran is officially completely fine, and the way she ended up dead inside of it was just one of those things that sometimes happens to teenagers in retail. Mandip, who had been considering filing a civil lawsuit against Walmart over her daughter's death, has now had any potential case severely undermined by the Department of Labor's official ruling, because on paper, no laws were broken and no procedures were violated, which means there is now essentially nothing for a civil court to even pin liability on. As of right now, 18 full months after Mandip pulled open that oven door, the family still does not know how their daughter ended up inside of it, how long she was conscious in there, whether she screamed, or why the internal release mechanism that the oven is required to have did not save her life. Walmart, for their part, kept the Halifax-Mumford Road location completely closed for a full 4 months following the incident, during which time they fully renovated the store, moved the bakery section to a different part of the floor, and quietly replaced every single walk-in oven in the building with new non-walk-in models. Their official corporate position remains, and once again I am quoting them directly, that they exercised appropriate due diligence in fulfilling our duties under relevant health and safety laws, which is, in my opinion, a really fascinating thing to publicly insist on, while simultaneously also choosing to remove every single walk-in oven from the store where a 19-year-old girl was baked to death, because if their due diligence had actually been fulfilled, they would not need to do that. You only do that if, somewhere deep down, you secretly think that those ovens might just maybe be the kind of machine that occasionally bakes a teenager. But the general public was horrified, and more than 5,000 people sent donations to Gursimran's family, and her GoFundMe ended up raising almost $200,000, even though it was originally only set for $50,000. The next case is the most recent on this entire list, having taken place only about 3 weeks ago, as of me making this video, on the morning of Tuesday, April 21st, 2026, at a Japanese theme park called Tokyo Dome City Attractions, located right in the central Bunkyo ward of Tokyo. The park has been around in some form since all the way back in 1958, when it originally opened under the name Korakuen Amusement Park, and it actually sits right next to the Tokyo Dome itself, which is one of the most famous baseball stadiums in all of Japan. Tokyo Dome City Attractions was rebranded under its current name in 2003, and these days it pulls in millions of visitors every single year, with everything from gigantic roller coasters to mild family rides scattered across the property. One of those milder family rides at the park was, or rather is now, an attraction called the Flying Balloon. The Flying Balloon was, by pretty much every possible measure, the kind of ride you would put your toddler on without thinking twice about it. It consisted of 12 colorful gondola-style seats arranged in a circle around a central pillar, and the entire ring of seats would slowly rotate while lifting passengers up to a height of about 10 meters, which is roughly 33 feet, giving riders a very gentle spinning view of the Tokyo skyline. It was officially marketed as one of the park's accessible, all-ages attractions, the type of ride that exists specifically so that visitors with very small children have something to actually enjoy in between the real roller coasters and the Ferris wheels. The 24-year-old at the center of this case was named Hina Kamimura. She was a relatively recent hire at Tokyo Dome Corporation, the company that operates the park, and according to her colleagues, she was an enthusiastic, reliable young woman who actually genuinely loved working in the amusement park industry, and who often volunteered to take on the more detailed inspection tasks during routine maintenance days, because that was just the kind of employee she was. That Tuesday morning, Hina and 5 of her colleagues had been assigned to conduct a routine monthly maintenance inspection on the Flying Balloon ride, and they had begun their work at 10 a.m., while the park itself was still closed to the public. The inspection process for a ride like this involves checking, among other things, the hydraulic systems, the various electrical components, and, most critically, the seat locking mechanisms that are supposed to hold the gondolas in place at the very top of the central pillar during downtime. Because see, while the ride is not actively in operation, the entire ring of seats is supposed to be hoisted up to the top of the central pole and locked firmly into place there, specifically to keep them from doing the one thing they are absolutely never supposed to do, which is, of course, suddenly drop. Hina was working on a stepladder near the central pillar, inspecting the inside of the pole itself, when the seats, which were sitting locked at the top of the structure roughly 33 feet above her, just sort of stopped being locked, and the entire ring of 12 seats came straight down. Hina's upper body was caught between the central pillar she was inspecting and the heavy supporting plate that held the seats, and she was very brutally pinned against the metal. Her colleagues heard her scream before any of them had even fully realized what had happened. The emergency call went out at 11:55 a.m., and a full disaster response team showed up to the park, including firefighters, police officers, and a specialized medical assistance team. And then they spent the next 5 hours trying to get her out of there. 5 hours. Because of how tight the space was inside the pillar, and how heavy the components on top of her actually were, the rescue crews had to use specialized tools to very slowly and very carefully separate the seat plate from the pillar, without making everything significantly worse, while Hina remained pinned the entire time. By the time they finally got her free and rushed her to a nearby hospital, it was just far too late, and she was pronounced dead later that same evening. Tokyo Dome Corporation issued the standard, deeply formal Japanese corporate apology, which is genuinely its own genre of writing entirely, and which extended their, and I quote, deepest prayers for the repose of the deceased employee's soul, along with their, again I quote, profound condolences and apologies to her bereaved family.
現場にいたんですよ、昨日。なんでそんな何時間かかったのかなって。自分たちは信用して乗ってるから。
心から楽しめないなって思う。
After this incident, the whole park was closed indefinitely, and the ride is being thoroughly investigated, and the cause of the seats suddenly dropping like that has, as of right now, still not been publicly determined. This is also, importantly, not Tokyo Dome City Attractions' first run-in with this kind of thing. Way back in 2011, a 34-year-old man had fallen from another ride at this exact same park, called the Spinning Coaster Maiheim, after his lap bar had not been properly secured before the ride began. That incident, by the way, was actually the third safety incident at this single park, in the span of just 3 months, and the formal investigation that followed found that the ride's operating manuals had been genuinely inadequate, which then led to a major operational overhaul of the entire park. And despite all of that, here we are again, exactly 15 years later, with a 24-year-old dead on the same property, on a completely different ride, in a way that should have been, by all basic engineering principles, completely impossible. We're back to the United States, specifically to the morning of Wednesday, September 17th, 2025, in West Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at a frozen pizza manufacturing facility owned by Palermo's Pizza, which is the company that makes those Connie's, Screamin' Sicilian, and Urban Pie frozen pizzas you have probably seen sitting in the freezer aisle of basically every American supermarket. The guy at the center of this case was 45-year-old Robert Cherone, who lived in nearby Elkhorn, Wisconsin, and was working an early morning shift on the production line that Wednesday when he was, very simply, crushed to death by a robotic machine on the floor. By the time first responders arrived at the plant, they found him already trapped inside the machinery, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. Palermo's, for their part, issued exactly the corporate statement template you would expect at this point in the video, expressing how deeply saddened they were by the tragic accident, how they were fully cooperating with the government officials, and how their hearts went out to Robert's family. What they very pointedly did not mention, because of course they did not, was that this was nowhere near the first serious safety incident at this exact same facility, because back in May of 2013, a 21-year-old Burmese immigrant who had been working at this same Palermo's plant lost 3 of his fingers in an industrial dough mixer that suddenly turned itself on while he was cleaning it. OSHA's investigation that followed found that Palermo's had failed to implement even the most basic lockout-tagout procedures during cleaning operations, which is the same exact safety failure that has repeatedly killed workers throughout this entire video. The fine Palermo's paid for those 3 fingers came out to a grand total of $13,500. Around that same time, OSHA also discovered that the Palermo's plant was casually storing roughly 30,000 pounds of anhydrous ammonia on site as part of its industrial refrigeration system, in the middle of a densely populated residential Milwaukee neighborhood, with massively inadequate employee emergency training and basically no real plan in place if there was ever a leak or, just a massive explosion. They got cited for 8 separate violations on the ammonia system alone. And in June of 2012, after Palermo's workers actually went on strike over 70 to 90-hour work weeks and constant injuries from severed fingers and repetitive trauma, Palermo's response was to immediately turn over 89 of their own employees to ICE for a work authorization audit and then fire 75 of the striking workers within a single week. One of the former workers, named Cesar Hernandez, later told The Nation magazine that when he had once complained about a malfunctioning sealing machine that had nearly amputated his finger, his supervisor's exact word-for-word response had been, and I am quoting this directly, "Here we do things as my balls say. Whoever doesn't like it can leave," which is just a shockingly honest summary of the entire corporate philosophy at this particular place. Robert Cherone's death is technically still under active OSHA investigation as of right now, but given the company's overall track record, I would not necessarily hold my breath waiting for a fine that would actually amount to anything more than what Palermo's earns from a single decent afternoon of frozen pizza sales. It's about 12:50 p.m. on the afternoon of Tuesday, October 11th, 2022, on a quiet residential street called Peggy Lane in the suburban park neighborhood of Menlo Park, California, which sits right in the heart of Silicon Valley about an hour south of San Francisco. On this particular afternoon, a tree trimming crew from a company called F.A. Bartlett Tree Expert Company had been hired to trim a row of coast live oaks lining the street, which is the kind of routine residential maintenance job that tree trimming companies do basically every single day across California, and which is, statistically speaking, also one of the more dangerous types of work you can possibly do anywhere in the entire United States. The guy at the center of this case was 47-year-old Jesus Salvadore Contreras Benitez, who lived in nearby Redwood City. Salvadore had originally been born in Mexico and had immigrated to California as a teenager with not really much more than a 6th grade education to his name. Over the years, he had been deported twice, but each time he had fought his way back because he was absolutely determined to put down real roots in California, and because he was also sending money home every month to support his parents back in Mexico. His son's girlfriend would later tell the local press that Salvador was, in her exact words, all about safety, which is going to become deeply ironic in about 30 seconds. Salvadore's role on the F.A. Bartlett crew that afternoon was groundsman, which meant his job was specifically to take all of the branches and limbs that his co-workers were cutting down from up in the trees and then feed them into the company's industrial wood chipper. The official safety protocol for loading a wood chipper, by the way, is that 2 people are supposed to be doing it together at all times, specifically because the failure mode of these machines is just brutal enough that you essentially need a second person standing right there as a failsafe. But on this particular afternoon, for reasons that have honestly never been fully explained, Salvadore had decided that he was going to do the job by himself, His co-workers were up in the canopy doing their cutting when, at some point, his glove apparently caught on a branch that he was feeding into the chipper. The chipper then did the exact thing that wood chippers are mechanically designed to do, which is rapidly pull material in. His co-workers up in the trees heard the chipper running, then looked down toward where Salvatore had been standing on the ground, and saw only blood. Again, as usual, the OSHA stepped in.
A gruesome accident on the peninsula. A tree trimmer is dead after falling into a wood chipper this afternoon.
And their investigation eventually concluded with $72,500 in fines against F.A. Bartlett Tree Expert Company. F.A. Bartlett is also currently appealing those fines, by the way, and the basis of their appeal, in the company's own exact words, is that independent employee action caused the violation, and that no actual safety regulations had been violated by the company, which is, in plain English, F.A. Bartlett arguing that this was actually Salvatore's fault for breaking the two-person protocol, even though they were the ones who had put him on the job alone in the first place. We have finally arrived at our last case for today, and this one takes us all the way across the Atlantic to the early morning of Saturday, October 16, 2010, at a Morgan Stanley data center located in Hounslow, which is a borough in West London right next to Heathrow Airport. And yes, that Morgan Stanley, the giant New York investment bank, that, at the time of this particular case, had something like $50 billion in annual revenue and was one of the single most profitable financial institutions in the entire world. The data center in Hounslow was one of the company's main UK data infrastructure hubs, and like basically every massive data center on the planet, it required constant ongoing electrical and mechanical maintenance work to keep it running. To handle that work, Morgan Stanley had hired a contractor called Norland Managed Services, which is a UK-based facilities management firm that was, at the time, a subsidiary of the giant Los Angeles commercial real estate company CBRE Group, and Norland was responsible for the day-to-day mechanical and electrical maintenance of the facility. Then, on top of that arrangement, Morgan Stanley had also separately hired a different company called Balfour Beatty Engineering Services to carry out a multi-million-pound infrastructure upgrade project, which involved connecting the data center to a brand new electrical substation and installing even more power distribution units throughout the building. Then Balfour Beatty had subcontracted some of the actual cabling work to a third company called Integrated Cable Services, which means that by the morning of October 16th, there were now 4 entirely separate corporate entities standing between Morgan Stanley at the top and the actual guy who had to physically touch the wires at the bottom. Sound familiar yet? The actual guy in question was 27-year-old Martin Walton, who had grown up in a small mining village called Blackhall Colliery, way up in northeastern England, and who was working as a cable jointer for Integrated Cable Services on the Hounslow project that weekend. By every account, Martin was just a regular working-class British guy doing a regular working-class British job, who had been sent down to a giant Morgan Stanley data center near Heathrow Airport for what was supposed to be a totally routine weekend infrastructure upgrade. Now, here is where this case gets a little bit technical, but stay with me, because this is the part that ends up actually mattering. The new power distribution units that Balfour Beatty was installing that weekend had been designed to receive power from 2 separate sources. The first source was an existing substation on site, which was under the control of Norland, and the second source was the brand new substation that Balfour Beatty was actually building. Last-minute modifications to the units meant that they had to be tested with both power supplies live and active before they could actually be connected to the wider infrastructure, which is, on its own, an extremely dangerous procedure that requires extremely careful coordination between everyone involved. But that coordination did not happen. The first of 3 units was successfully modified, tested, and connected. Then, while Martin was working on the second unit, Norland issued him a formal permit to work that allowed him to reroute the existing site power supply through the new distribution unit without ever once actually confirming that the other power supply, the one being controlled by Balfour Beatty, had been properly isolated. So Martin walked over to the second unit, leaned in, and his forehead came into direct contact with a 415-volt live terminal that everyone involved on the project had simply assumed was de-energized, but it was not. It had a shit ton of electricity that fried his head, and he died at the scene. The health and safety executive's eventual investigation into the case, which I should mention took an absolutely glacial 5 full years to wrap up and reach trial, found that the underlying cause of Martin's death was, quote, a succession of failures indicative of the complete breakdown of Balfour Beatty's management of health and safety in relation to this project, and also that not one person involved in the work at the time of the accident had an accurate overall understanding of the work being carried out. which means that, in plain English, 4 different companies were all working on the same data center, all interacting with the same energized electrical equipment, and not a single human being on the site fully understood what anyone else around them was actually doing. In October 2015, Balfour Beatty was finally fined a total of £280,000 plus court costs, and Norland was fined £100,000 plus its own costs. Morgan Stanley itself, who had hired all of these companies, and whose data center this had all happened inside of, faced no charges whatsoever. And Norland, in their official public statement after the trial, very specifically argued that the breach had not been the result of any, and I quote, systemic or management failings, but had instead been due to inadvertence on the part of one individual, which is the exact same deflection pattern we have seen in basically every single case in this video, the exact same attempt to take a clear structural failure and squeeze it down into a single dead worker's individual fault. And here is the thing that really made me sit with this last case as I was researching it for this video. Because a survey of data center professionals conducted by the Uptime Institute around the time of Martin's trial found that roughly 1/3 of organizations in the entire industry were still allowing maintenance work to be carried out on energized electrical equipment, and around 60% of professionals reported being personally uncomfortable with the practice, but only 30% of them actually worked in regions where the practice was prohibited by local regulations, which means that the kind of corporate setup that ended up killing Martin Walton was not unusual or exceptional at all. Heck, it was not even particularly rare. It was, and almost certainly still is, just how a huge portion of the global data center industry operates on a completely normal Tuesday. And honestly, that ends up being the through line for everything we have looked at across this entire video. Every single one of these cases, from Dawn Branchot at SeaWorld, to Vincent Smith in the chocolate vat, to Lucas at the Volkswagen plant, to Min Soo at the pepper factory, to Brian, to Hugo, to Jill, to Samuel, to Nicholas, to Gersimran, to Hina, to Robert, to Salvador, and now to Martin. Every single one of them was framed afterwards as some kind of freak accident, like some kind of tragic but isolated event, or some kind of completely unforeseeable thing. But none of these were actually freak accidents, as you yourself must have noticed by now. They were the entirely predictable outcomes of corporate structures that have been carefully designed over decades to make sure that when a worker dies, the layers of subcontractors and shell companies and inadequate fines, and the whole independent employee action defenses all line up just right, so that nobody high enough up the chain to have actually prevented it ever has to pay any meaningful price for it.